to take off the paper. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. We're getting kind of in the home stretch here, so that's pretty good. I'm going to just take a minute and do a check-in about the last chapters, because I know it's kind of confusing towards the end. This is one of the things that's a little tricky about this book. But so the last time that we were reading, essentially it was sort of the wind down of the big op in the caverns under the UCSD biolabs. And so the group had been going through the biolabs, and Alice, who was Robert Gu's daughter-in-law, she was the cyber analyst, and she kind of had this manufactured breakdown due to Alfred Vaz, the bad guy, had sort of maxed out her psychological just-in-time training, and she had a breakdown, and her husband Robert had to take her off the case. So that was part of that chapter. And then you remember Robert Gu's granddaughter Miri was sort of running through. She had they had beaten up Juan, her friend, up top, and she jumped down the hole, and she was running through trying to find her grandfather. And so she met up with them, and then they were in the area where the shredded library books were, the Huertas storage chamber, and they were going to cover all of the shredded library books in some sort of time-based glue that would glue it together, but then later release it to sort of mess up their ability to scan the documents. And so as they were trying that, there was this one little robot that Alfred Vaz, who is sort of the bad guy, who's secretly trying to set up his own biolab experiment in the labs. He sends this one robot, and they end up zapping it, but at the same time, the robot does something to Tommy, who's in the group, his pacemaker. So he starts to die, and they have to like drag him out of the cave. And they found that there's like this back door. And meanwhile, the rabbit figure has shown up, and he's operating through the laptop. And the rabbit is sort of like this AI, and he's undermining Alfred Vaz. And so he's trying to offer guidance to the team to get out of the cave with Tommy, who's having like a heart attack because his pacemaker is failing because the robot zapped him. And so as they're going through, but then they unplug the whole thing. But the rabbit, before they unplug, sends a PDF to Robert on like how to get out. And so they do manage to get out. But then when they get out of they open the back door, and they're sort of on this mountain, this remote mountain, and there's nowhere really to get health assistance for Tommy. So they're trying to figure out like what happens next. So in the meantime, Miri, the granddaughter, is remotely connected to her grandmother, Robert's ex-wife, Lena, and her roommate, Zhu Zhang, who is another one of these sort of recovered Alzheimer's patients who is sharing, she's their roommate in the retirement home, and she's sort of she's an engineer, like a creative engineer. So they've been like roaming around in these automated cars, and then eventually the car says, "Oh, you can't be here anymore because there's, a riot or whatever," and they get sent home. So they're eventually they figured out a way to sort of redirect the car, and they're trying to get up to the mountain where they've come out the back door. Okay, so that's sort of where we're at to start. Okay, and then now we're going to start with chapter 28, which is the animal model, ? Okay, so even on a slow day, thousands of certificates. Oh, this is the other thing. So the rabbit evidently functions on certificates, which are sort of like blockchain. And evidently the cyber analysts with Alfred have figured out that all of his certificates go back to Credit Suisse. And so they've decided that the rabbit is out of hand, and they're going to unplug him. But to do that, they have to revoke the Credit Suisse certificates, which is essentially going to crash the global economy. And the German friend Gunberg, he's going to be like out of his job because he had to pull the certificates on the rabbit, which will crash the economy. So that's where it's starting. The animal model. Even on a slow day, thousands of certificates got revoked every hour. It was a messy process, but a necessary consequence of frauds detected, court orders executed, and credit denied. Now, this is important to think about for the blockchain stuff. All but a handful of revocations were short cascades of denied transactions involving a single individual and his or her immediate certificate authority, or a small company and its CA. Perhaps once a year, there would be a significant cascade, usually when a large company ran into an uncompromising creditor and a court order was delivered to a mid-level CA. And even more rarely, a revocation might be part of a military action, as in the fall of South Ossetia. In theory, the revocation protocols were worked with arbitrarily large CAs, but until this night, no apex certificate authority had ever issued global revocations. And Credit Suisse was one of the 10 largest CAs in the world. Most of its business was in Europe, but its certificates bound webs of unmeasured complexity all over the planet, affecting the interactions of people who might speak no European language. Tonight, all those unknowing customers would learn of their connection. The failures spread as timeouts on certificates from intermediate CAs and where time-critical trust was involved as direct notifications. In Europe, airplanes and trains came smoothly to a stop without a single accident or fatality. 1 billion failures were noted, and emergency services moved with varying success into action. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security noticed the failures and the growing collateral damage. Analyst pools in the U.S. reached out to other great powers and conferred under emergency protocols established years ago. Chinese public safety, the Indo-European Intelligence Services, the US DHS, they all agreed that a Category 1 disaster was in progress, a really bad software failure or a novel terrorist attack. In certain corners of Indo-European intelligence, understanding was more precise, considerably more precise. Braun to Mitsuri Vaz. So I have done it. Has it had any effect on Rabbit? Closed message. So far, there was only a small failure at UCSD, just a few certificates timing out. And that was enough to make some projections. The crowds had not consciously noticed the changes, but the library riot was due for an abrupt and ignominious end. Even more than the analysts had guessed, Rabbit had been behind what they had seen tonight, and now that support was rotting away. Down in the labs, Rabbit had been an almost invisible intruder. Confirming the absence of that intrusion was not easy, but Alfred's analyst had a consensus. Vaz to Braun Mitsuri. Communication failures are up, but not in our core operation. Rabbit is still here, but he's losing flexibility. Closed message. Braun to Mitsuri Vaz. Losing flexibility? By damn, we need more than that. What about his 2 agents? What are they doing? Vaz to Braun Mitsuri. They've wandered out of our area. Closed message. Well, that wasn't precisely true, but Gus and what remained of Rabbit were properly diverted. Now I just need a few more minutes. Rabbit was under pressure. He always told himself that he performed best under pressure, though usually the pressure was not so immediate, nor his opponent so powerful and humorless. Other than some of the low-ranking analysts, Rabbit didn't know anyone on the Indo-European side who could take a joke. Rabbit looked out through a dozen cameras, everything that Alfred had suborned in the MCOG area. His hands had entered their area just a few moments before, and maybe that was what had panicked his enemies into their massive revocation attack. With a small and dwindling part of his attention, he followed the wonderful riot around the library. Sigh. Alfred and company had never guessed his connection with Scoochamoot, and yet, who'd have thunk they'd detect his affection for Credit Suisse CA, or that the EU had such power over the certificate authority of a sovereign country, or that his own dependence was as broad as he was now discovering. Rabbit had other apex CAs, though none so useful as Credit Suisse. They would suffice for a few more minutes. And where they didn't, he had legal programs posting appeals against the most destructive of the revocations. Meantime, focus on the fun things. What was Alfred trying to do? Sheer destruction? Intellectual theft? Rabbit was beginning to feel mean. And now he meant to steal it all, starting with the fruit flies. Rabbit reached out for his hands. Robert remembered this area. They were back in the heart of Gen country, the unending rows of gray cabinets, the crystal forests that connected them, the pneumo tubes, but up ahead was a sound like cardboard boxes being crushed. The stranger's PDF had explanations for the abbreviations that pointed on the sides of the cabinets. Dross MCOG, Robert Tamiri, fruit flies, closed message. That was where he had set down almost a third of the little boxes, having to crawl over and above and between the cabinets. Mary to Robert, yes, did you read what Smart Alec claims about this? I don't believe it. Closed message. Hey, my man. And there was mysterious stranger, Muri's Mr. Smart Alec. His skin was practically glowing green, even in the shadows. The face was Sharif's, but the smile was inhumanly wide. Talk as you please. Alfred discovered us here several minutes ago. The stranger looked around as if expecting a visible enemy. So now I don't care if he hears you. Or me. What can you do, Alfred? You're shutting me down. But I wager I'll last another minute or two. Oh, I suppose you could shut down your own operation too, and I'd be instantly gone then. He glanced back at Mary and Robert and continued sotto voce. If he does that, he's truly desperate, and it won't help him a bit. Since you still have my PDF, you'll still be here to destroy his underhanded plans. The mysterious stranger waved for them to follow. Did you get to this part of my explanation? He waved at the cabinets. Molecular biology of cognition, MCOG, and Alfred's people have created the ideal animal model for their research. Fruit flies? Said Robert. I don't believe it, said Mary. Fruit flies can't think. What could Alfred or you do with them? The stranger gave out one of his dismissive laughs, and Robert noticed Mary's face jerk up. She might do better with this manipulator than Robert. After all, she wasn't desperate for his help. Ah, Mary, you read, but you don't understand. If you had access just now to the wider net and a few hundred hours of research, perhaps you would understand that molecular biology depends more on data depth and analysis than it does on the particular class of organisms. In his Dropsophila melanogaster alfredi, is that what you call them, Alfred? We have the metabolic pathways that are the basis for all animal cognition. Minus the editorial comments, this didn't look like some of the PDF. Viola, Alfred's 300,000 fruit flies, now being folded into convenient shipping cartridges. The stranger's face and body bore less and less of a resemblance to the original Sharif. But I must confess, I know what these little bugs are, but I don't really know what Alfred had planned for them. Surely there is some marvelous disease, cognitive disease, that might come out of such research. Or maybe he wants to get a head start on all the enhancement drug people. Or maybe he's into YGBM. You've got to believe me. But I do know the fruit fly arrays were being folded on a large transport table, much bigger than anything in Ron Williamson's shop class. The shipping cylinders rolled across the table, right through the stranger's body. The creature noticed this half a second late, but did a creditable hop back from the table. But I do know that he's trying to ship them off-site. So you claim. Hey, trust me, Miss Mary, you've met Alfred. He's the fellow who tried to kill Juan Orozco. The guy's an evil loon. Ping the labels on these packages if you don't believe me. Yes. Up X labels with an encrypted destination. The first of the cylinders was sliding off the table, heading toward the nearest pneumo tube. And now the stranger was hopping from one foot to the other. Only you can save mankind. Just knock the cylinders onto the lower tray. Don't let Alfred win. And that seemed to convince Mary. She rushed to the table, grabbed the package out of the pneumo tube lock, and tossed it to Robert. He caught it and the next, and now his arms were full. The white cylinders were as light as foam. The stranger's image froze for a second. Abruptly, animation returned. Excellently done. He waved vaguely at the walls. See that, Alfred? It doesn't pay to cross the rabbit. Rabbit? The creature turned back in their general direction. By God, it did look a bit like a rabbit. That was a near thing, but I won. I mean, we saved mankind. It drew itself up, but its whole body was tilted. Damn, Alfred. He is shutting me down a piece at a time. Maybe I should exit with my impression of the Wicked Witch of the West. Dying, that is. And the creature spun around, giving a melodramatic moans, its body dissolving around it. It hesitated and said offhandedly to Robert, "Oh, don't let the cylinders go untreated. Just drop them onto the lower tray." Robert didn't move. "I mean it," said the stranger, something like a serious tone creeping into its voice. It flailed about, more dramatic dying, or looking for an explanation. "If the bugs are disease vectors, you're at ground zero. The lower tray will send them to an incinerator, all safe and tidy." Mary shook her head. "No, that's an alternate path to the UpX launcher." "Look at my PDF, you fool, the map." "I looked at my map, the one I cached this afternoon." Mary's smile was triumphant. There was a 2-second lag, and then the creature turned and looked almost straight at Mary. "I hate you, Mary Goo. You evil thing. Everything was going so well until you started meddling. I'll get you for this." And then it was shouting, "Meantime, I'm going to get you, Alfred. If I'm out of action, so are you. I'm blowing the whistle on you. I'm..." And the figure stopped moving. There was a moment of silence, and then Robert heard a single word, faint and far away. "Help." And the creature vanished. Robert and Mary stared at each other. It was just the two of them and the ranks of cabinets. "Do you think he's really gone, Mary?" I don't know." Mary to Robert. "But if Smart Alec wasn't lying about everything, then this Alfred guy still is around." Closed message. Aloud, her words were timid. Maybe we should stay here and wait for the police." "Okay." Mary plunked herself down on the floor, and she was very quiet for a moment, both publicly and privately. Robert set the packages down and stared off into the dark, looking this way and that. Supposedly, there were no more enemy robots. I mean, what could Alfred do with fruit flies now? What could the fellow do to Mary and Robert himself? Mary to Robert. "Things don't sound the same." Closed message. Robert looked a question at her, and Mary drew a golden arrow at right angles to the corridor they had arrived from. Mary to Robert. "I kept track of everything I heard when I was following you. There's something new going on. Most likely in the mouse arrays. Did you do anything on over that way?" Closed message, and she quietly came back to her feet. Robert tapped his keypad. Robert to Mary. "That's where we put most of our equipment." Closed message. Mary's chin came up. Mary to Robert. "The sounds are like what we heard here. Someone's packaging another shipment out." Okay, so that's end of chapter 28. So chapter 29, Dr. Zhang takes charge. That's Robert's ex-wife Lena's roommate. And she's a recovering oldster who's an engineer. Gunberg and Keiko, so they're working with Alfred. Gunberg and Keiko and Alfred each had their own analyst pools. 10 seconds ago, those analysts had agreed. As an active threat, Rabbit was gone, both topside and in the operations millnet. Dissent clusters hung around the opinion, but they were related to collateral damage prediction. Braun to Mitsuri Vaz. God willing, we've stopped the monster. Closed message. Mitsuri to Braun Vaz. And we have the inspection data we came for, and now it's time to get the hell out. Closed message. She brought up a zoomed picture of the contingency tree. They were way out on a limb that led to full loss of deniability. And yet, until they knew for sure the results of their investigation, they needed the Americans kept ignorant. Alfred presented his latest extraction schedule, the times padded just enough to cover his outshipment activities. Mitsuri to Braun Vaz, 8 minutes, that much. Keiko still had things covered on the north side of the labs, and the views of the riot showed the Bollywood team still in place at the library. But that affair was descending into civil disorder, the sort of thing that brings a direct police response. Meshing Alfred back into the Bollywood people would be easy now, and very soon it would be impossible. Vaz to Braun Mitsuri. I'll trim every second I can, Keiko. Closed message. Mitsuri to Braun. Vaz. You'd better. 5 minutes is the most I can guarantee. Closed message. Alfred's smile at Keiko's impolitely constrained panic. She and Gunberk would do their best, and in some ways this chaos was helpful. Fooling Gunberk and Keiko had always been Alfred's biggest problem. His outshipment would have been impossible if they hadn't been so distracted. 2 minutes passed. 3. His secret team had completed most of the fakery. They had updated the logs to satisfy both Alliance and future investigators, and now they were working with one small section of the mus musculus arrays, his true animal model. Alfred hopped from viewpoint to viewpoint, swooping over cabinets that looked like office blocks in some bland utilitarian city. He couldn't take more than a few of the mice, just a few of those conceived since the last update. His team had already shut down the in-progress experiments and started destruct operations, and now they detached the chosen arrays and began prepping them for launch. Other members of the team were already sending shipping cartridges to the pneumo port atop the cabinet. He could fit 20 by 30 array, 600 mice each into each cartridge. Mitsuri to Braun. Vaz. Alfred, the public net is failing. Closed message. Vaz swore and glanced at the topside analysis. This wasn't even close to Keiko's deadline. Braun to Mitsuri. Vaz. It's a full system failure. Mr. Rabbit has screwed us. Closed message. The analysts were boiling with contrary opinions. Failures like this happen a couple times a year somewhere in the world, the price that civilization paid for complexity. But here there was a more sinister suspicion that this failure was collateral damage from the revocation. Maybe Rabbit's riot magic depended on his commandeering the embedded computer system of the public environment. Now that his certificates were revoked, there was a cascade of failures working through almost everything just as fast as the certificates failed. Mitsuri to Braun. Vaz. Alfred, clean up and get out. Closed message. The second and third cartridges would be ready in a moment. Alfred glanced at the UpX status. The launcher was close to the MCOG area, and most important, it was locally managed, unaffected by the crash outside. He entered a destination in Guatemala and selected a launch vehicle that he'd emplaced some weeks before. It ought to be stealthy enough to get out of U.S. airspace. Vaz to Braun Mitsuri. 1 minute, can you give me that? Closed message. Mitsuri to Braun. Vaz. I will try. Closed message. The topside analysts were hard into contingency planning and probability estimates. 1,000 little changes were being made across the UCSD landscape wherever the Indo-European operation had influence. The Bollywood presence would survive as long as any up there. And Alfred forced his attention back into the labs. The second cartridge was loading. The first cartridge was shooting down the pneumo, taking its little passengers to the launcher. Alfred froze. The Gus were gone from the fruit fly area. The goos were gone from the fruit fly area. There was a movement in another window at the edge of the mice arrays, a girl and a man running towards the camera. They hadn't been fooled by the fruit flies. Alfred leaned forward. Okay, 1 minute. What could his people cook up in that time? Lena's wheelchair was no hiking machine. Okay, so now we're in another scene. Lena is Robert Goo's ex-wife. Lena's wheelchair was no hiking machine. It did well enough on the asphalt, even going uphill. Zoo had to trot to keep up. But where there was asphalt was carved by gullies that chair had to walk. The going got very slow. Can you even see the road, Lena? Her view page was as dark as the natural view. No, I think someone has turned off the hillside side effect of the riot, maybe. She moved over to the middle of the road. Shh, they're coming. She waved at Zhu to come forward. How can we stop them? One way or another, we have to find out what's happening. Robert will see you. Damnation, Lena dithered, caught in a dilemma. Go back to the side of the road. I can stop them more safely anyway. Humph, said Lena. But she retreated. Zhu stood still for a moment. There was the distant sounds of the freeway. And from over the hilltop, there were no noises that might have been there were noises that might have been chanting. From over the hilltop, but nearby, sorry, but nearby was just insect sounds, the feel of air cooling in the night, the narrow roadway jumbled and rocky under her feet. She saw light sweep across the outcroppings above her. I can hear them, Ju. Ju could too. The crunch of tires and now the faint whine of electric motors. The mystery car came around at last, a last unseen bend in the road, and she tensed to dive out of the way. But on this road, cars could not speed. Its headlights slowly bore down on her. Make way, make way. The words were loud, and the view page in her hand came alight with flashing warnings about penalties for interfering with the California Highway Patrol. Ju started giving way, but then she thought, but it's the CHIP I want to talk to. She waved for the car to stop, and the vehicle slowed down still more and then turned and tried to edge past her on the left. Make way, make way. No, she shouted and hopped back in front. You stop. The car moved even more slowly. Make way, make way. And it tried to pass her on the other side, and Zoo jumped in the way again, this time flailing her backpack as though it could do some damage. And the auto backed up a yard or two and turned slyly as if preparing an end run, and Zoo wondered if she really wanted to jump in front of what happened next. With every heartbeat, pain spiked through Tommy. After a moment, he realized that was good news. He raised his head and saw that he was stretched out on the back seat of a passenger car. That was Winston and Carlos in the facing seats. Where's Robert and his little girl? Winston Blount shook his head. They stayed behind. We split up, Professor Parker. Scary memories were coming back. Oh, yeah. Where's my laptop? We got to call 911. We called, Tommy. Everything's okay. This is the CHP vehicle. Despite his haziness, that didn't make sense. It sure doesn't look like one. We called, Tommy. Everything's okay. It's got all the insignia, Tommy, but there was dawning uncertainty in Winston's voice, and Tommy slid his legs from the seat and pushed himself into a half-sitting position. The pain squeezed tight in his chest, clawing out along his arms, and he almost blacked out again, and he would have fallen forward if not for Carlos. Hold me up. Tommy looked forward. The car's headlights were on. The road was steep and narrow with scattered remnants of asphalt surfacing, the sort of thing you might see in the East Country or in short stretches along the coast, a disconnected remnant of lost roadway. They slowed, negotiating deeply shadowed gullies. Bushes swept close around them, and now ahead he saw someone standing in the middle of the road. The car slowed to a crawl, just 5 yards short. It was a young woman. Make way, make way, their car said over and over, trying to get by one side and then the other. The woman hopped from side to side, blocking them, and she was shouting and swinging a good-sized backpack at them. Their car backed up a few feet, and Tommy heard the faint squeal of the capacitor preparing for something drastic. The wheels turned a few degrees, and the woman jumped in front of them again, and her face was bright in the headlights. It was a pretty Asian face. If you added 30 years to it, you got the face from some very distasteful turn-of-the-century papers in secure computing. She was the last person he'd ever expect to play block the tanks at Tiananmen Square. The headlights went out. The car jolted forward, and then the brakes engaged, and they slid halfway into the ditch. And there was a muffled explosion that might have been the capacitor slagging itself, and the doors on both sides of the vehicle popped open, and Tommy slid partway into the cool night air. You okay, Professor Parker? That was Carlos's voice, coming from close behind his head. Not dead yet. He heard footsteps on the roadway. A light flared in the small hand, and the woman said loudly, It's Winston Blount and Carlos Rivera. And then, more conversationally, and Thomas Parker, you probably don't know me, Dr. Parker, but I have admired your work. Tommy didn't know what to say. Let us pass, said Winston. This is an emergency. He was interrupted by the sound of wheels, but not from another car. A voice spoke from the darkness. Where's Miri? Where's Robert? Carlos said, They're still inside. They're trying to stop We're afraid that someone is taking over the labs. Motors whined. It was a wheelchair carrying someone all hunched over, but the voice was strong and irritated. Damn it! Lab security would prevent that. Maybe not. Winnie sounded like he was chewing on broken glass. We think that someone has subverted security. We called 911. That's what you're interfering with. He waved at the car. It was halfway into the ditch, unmoving. Tommy looked at the darkened passenger car. No, he said, that's a fake. Please, you call 911. The wheelchair rolled nearer. I'm trying to, but we're in some kind of dead zone. We should go down the hill and find something we can latch onto. Oui, said Carlos, and he was staring all around the way kids do when their contacts fail. The redoubtable Dr. Zhang waved her little hand light and shade sweeping up and around her. Strange. There was a kind of hesitancy about her. Zhang was one of the true bad guys of the present era, at least one of the people who had made the bad guy regime possible, and you could never tell by looking at her. She doused the light and stood silently for a moment. I don't think we're in a local dead zone. Sure it is, said Winnie. I'm wearing and I can't see a thing except the real view. We have to get to the freeway or at least get a line of sight on it. And now Tommy remembered what Goo's granddaughter had said. Maybe the local nodes were being spoofed. Zhang had another theory. I mean, the dead zone is not just here. Listen. I don't hear a thing. Oh. There were little sounds. Insects, maybe? There was a faint shouting from over the hills. Okay, well, that must be the belief circle diversion, but what else? The freeway sounded strange. Not the constant throbbing surf of wheels on the road, and now there was only the faintest sound, a dying sigh. Tommy had never heard such a thing, but he knew how stuff worked. Failure, shutdown. Everything stopped? Said Carlos, horror climbing in his voice. Yep. Tommy's chest pain beat toward a crescendo. But hey, let me live long enough to learn what's going on. The voice from the wheelchair said, even if we can't get word out, someone will notice. Well, maybe not, Tommy gasped. If the blackout was large and spotty with the appearance of natural disaster, why, it might cover something really big going on underground. And there's nothing we can do to help, said Winston. Maybe not, Zhang's words echoed Tommy's, but her voice was thoughtful and distant. She flicked her light at the backpack. I've had a lot of fun in shop class. You can make so many interesting things, you know? And Tommy managed, yeah, and they all obey the law. Zhu Zhang's laugh was soft. Well, that fact can be used against itself, especially if the parts don't know the big picture. A lot of Tommy's old friends talked that way. It was mostly idle talk, but this was Zhu Zhang, and she pulled out a clunky-looking gadget. It looked like an old-time coffee can open at one end, and she held the coffee can where it could see her view page. Lots of gadgets are still working. They just can't find enough nodes to get a route out, but there's a big military base just north of here. From the wheelchair, Camp Pendleton is about 30 miles that away. Maybe the speaker gestured, but Tommy couldn't see. Zhang scanned her coffee can across the starless sky. This is crazy, said Winston. How can you know where there are nodes in your line of sight? I don't. I'm going to shine signals off the sky haze. I'm calling in the Marines. And then she was talking to her view page. Bob Gu and his Marines logged more time in training systems than they ever did in combat or on watch. Training managers were legendary for creating impossible emergencies and then topping them with something even more unbelievable. Tonight, the real world was outdoing the craziest of the trainers. Alice had been moved to intensive care. Bob would have gone with her, except that whatever had taken her down was the enemy action and not the end of it. The analyst display had sprouted new nodes and a dozen long-shot associations. Credit Suisse CA had just collapsed. A major disaster for Europe. The certificate revocations would have effects even in California. Bob took a closer look. The Credit Suisse collapse was so abrupt that it had to be a sophisticated attack. So what was a distraction from that? The DoD-DHS combined Earthwatch was involved now. Tonight's action could be something new, a grand terror that ran simultaneous through the USA and the Indo-European alliance, profiting from the gaps created by national sovereignties. Looking at the analysis above him, Bob could see only the broadest outlines, but it was evident that the intelligence agencies of the USA, the Alliance, and China were collaborating to hunt down the source of the threat. In CONUS Southwest, his new top analyst was doing her best. His analyst pool was still crippled, but folks were talking productively. Their structures of conjecture and conclusion were growing. The new top analyst took voice. Colonel, the revocation storm is very intense at UCSD. The traffic display showed that the demonstration around the library had ground to a halt. The new failures were not due to backbone router saturation. Participants were being decertified by the thousands. Millions of support programs were balked. If nothing else, this showed that massive foreign involvement in tonight's festivities had not been some analyst's pipe dream. Whatever had hit Europe was intimately involved there. But the biolab still showed green. Even the participation of the night crews in the library demonstrations had worked out for the best. And maybe productivity and performance would be down for this shift, but that was a commercial issue. In fact, the departure of the human crews had simplified the lab situation. There was nothing there but automation, and it showed all was well. FBI again requests clearance to take over. Bob shook his head irritably. Denied, as before. More than riot participants were being decertified. 3 analysts from Southern California Utilities reported infrastructure failures in the campus area. Now, why would local infrastructure depend on certs from Credit Suisse? Correlation of system failures with the revocation storm is 95%, Colonel. No kidding. Even if the labs were clean, there was some kind of deadly interference here. Bob tapped the command he had been contemplating these last few minutes. Launch alert. Analyst update contingency 9 and give me a launch mark, he said. There was a pause as the request was reviewed by DoD DHS Combined Earthwatch. His CONUS Southwest watch was on a very short leash since Alice's breakdown. But clearance came back in 5 seconds. Bob scarcely noticed his G-pod inflate. He would be the last out of the barn, so there was a lot to watch. Launch, launch, launch. Unscrewed vehicles launched. His displays showed 30 canisters of combat network munitions shot high into the Southern California night. The uncrews were on the north side of the base, 20 kilometers away, farther north from MCAS endroids. More primitive weapons rose into the heavens. Their manifest was a catalog of extreme possibilities. Rescue lances, 500. Damage suppression fogs, 100. HEIR lasers, 10. Thermal flechettes isolation variant, 100. And then the last 3, the nightmares. Sterilization fog dispensers, 10 by 10. HERF area munitions, 20 by 20 by 4. Strategic nuclear munitions, 10 by 10 by 2. Analysts are paid to think worst case, but Lord, the biolabs were the only excuse for these items. But in truth, if you discounted the absence of follow-up equipment, this was a fairly conventional load for a modern expeditionary force. 3 times in Bob's career, such launches had ended in real combat, but those had been half a world away, in Almaty and Ciudad General Ortiz and in Asuncion. The most terrible weapons had never been used, though Asuncion had been a very near thing. Tonight, he was aiming all of this hardware at his own neighbors, just 30 miles south of Camp Pendleton. Full force in an urban area was like going after rats in your kitchen with a machine gun. Keep your head down, Mary. FBI again requests clearance to take over. Denied. The situation had escalated, and for the moment, hopefully just for the moment, if police and rescue could bring the system back up, then all the hardware that Bob had just boosted over Southern California would simply be an expensive exercise. But one good thing about being locked and loaded was that he had lots more on-call resources. GU grabbed analyst teams from all across the national work shift and pushed the intel and sensor backlog at them. Priority questions: are the San Diego labs secure? What is the prognosis for the current system failure? Meantime, Bob's launches had soared to the top of their trajectories. He tweaked the Edmunds munitions still higher, delaying them behind the gear from Pendleton. If nothing was resolved soon, he would have to light the uncruised jets. I need answers, guys. But the analyst mob was still busy connecting a billion dots, looking for patterns and conspiracies. And then a single observation changed everything. Just a second. A weather service geek doing her monthly reserve duty grabbed a very high priority. 20 seconds ago, I see ad hoc signaling in the backscatter above here. And she drew an ellipse over San Diego North County, covering much of Camp Pendleton. Somebody was making their own communications, simply blinking a light into sky haze. The long axis of the scatter ellipse pointed right back towards UCSD, and the words of the intercepted message streamed across Bob's vision. Zhu Zhang to anyone clever enough to notice me in the backscatter. Gen laboratory automation has been corrupted. The system is attacking anyone opposing it. This is not a game. This is not a joke. What? Yes, I'll tell them. There are 2 people still in the labs. They are good guys. They are trying to help. Closed message. The NOAA analyst spoke over the script display. The message is a 1-second burst retransmitted 12 times. What you're seeing is the summed cleanup. It was clear enough. Bob Goo's fingers tapped in their gloves, launching his Marines. And then his own G-pod came tight, and for a moment, Bob Goo was not paying attention. And for a moment, he could not pay attention. Battle Commit put the combat CO himself into the fray. And in this case, Launch took his landing dart almost horizontally out of Pendleton. Maybe this is not a good idea, he thought muzzily. But he always thought that coming out of 20G railgun that coming out of a 20G railgun launch. And now he had to recollect his wits and context. His team and equipment were on schedule. The unthinkable last resorts were still high overhead, flexible to the last. The network munitions were already at UCSD, and the biolabs still showed green, all secure and peaceful, his own landing dart seconds away from the UCSD. And there was something else that was important, something in that last few seconds. Zhu Zhang. Bob's recollection came unsquished just as a DHS analyst team presented its own form of the insight. Zhu Zhang, not an uncommon name, but in all of Southern California, there probably weren't more than 3 or 4 who owned that name, and one lived at Rainbow's End with Lena Gu. And suddenly, he had a good idea who was in the crosshairs of all that he commanded. So that's the end of chapter 29. So we'll do one more. Chapter 30, When the Network Stops. The library had chosen. This is the UCSD library. For an instant, Timothy, Hugh, and all of the night crew were silent. The crowds of real humans were quiet, and even the millions of virtuals took part in a coordinated stillness. The library had chosen, and it had chosen the Scoochies. On the Hasek side, you could see the realization of defeat spreading. The triumph was real. How would the Hasekians take it? There had been a few debacles in the late teens when major belief structures had produced some awful art. Some were so bad that the circles themselves had shriveled and died. Who heard of the tines anymore, of the zones of thought? But tonight the Hasekians had lost at the hands of others, and they must do something. Maybe even something gracious. The silent stillness of the mob continued a second more, and then dangerous knowledge suddenly turned away from the library. Its gaze swept fiercely across them all. After all, playing loser wasn't in its repertoire, but whoever was behind all the creativity was flexible. After a moment, Dangerous smiled gently and turned back to the library. Its voice made concession sounds like the granting of a favor. We bow to the wishes of the library. Here you have won, O Scoochamoot. Wales across from the Hasek side, but Dangerous raised a hand and continued. We give up our claim here. We remain as guests only. Sheila to night crew. The Hasek people are in heavy discussion with the university administration. They're begging for whatever scraps they can get. Closed message. And the greater Scoochamoot was conciliatory in victory, though it didn't step away from its embrace of the library. You are welcome as guests in a library with real books. Hanson to night crew. Admin is squealing about that, but the publicity should pay for extra floor space. We've won. We've won, gang. And for some minutes, everything was cool. Ending a riot without a police confrontation or a physical debacle was a little bit anticlimactic, but riot designers had even more special effects to wind things down. Katie Rosenbaum gathered the spider bots all together and then sent them out to Hugh's mechs for a bizarre peace dance that incidentally cleaned up most of the night's garbage. Tim sensed negotiations going on between the two sides, things being traded, promises made, dangerous knowledge retreated into the sky, and both sides played special effects that were new on this night. But now, when things should have been getting smoother, there were network problems. Here and there, service was unusably slow or all jittery, and it made everyone look bad. Scoochamoot still stood by the library, embracing the pillar that had walked. You could hold a heroic gesture that long, and you could just look stupid. Hugh looked at his mech status board. There hadn't been a Scoochie update for almost 7 seconds, and that was no way to drive a mech. Hugh to Hanson. Hey, Sheila, who's driving the greater Scoochamoot? Hanson to Hugh. Dunno, he was good, but now he's dropped the ball. It's okay, we're winding down now. Just take control and walk the robot out. No need to look cool. And then she was messaging the whole night crew, trying to tidy up and get all her Gen people and gear back where they belonged. Hugh drove his forklift to the greater Scoochamoot mech. He walked over behind and tried to figure out some nice way to get the two off the field. His robot's mind-sum mists weren't matching its movements anymore. They looked like crap. Okay, he'd take control of the greater Scoochamoot and have the two robots give a last high five and then rumble out together. That would be cool, if not fully so. Maybe it didn't matter. The network problems were getting a lot worse. There were strange latencies and maybe real partitions. Blocks of the virtual audience were being run on cache. Single hops still mostly worked, but routed communication was in trouble. Hugh stepped a few feet to the side and managed to find a good diagnostic source. And there were certificate failures at the lowest levels, and they had never seen that before. Even the localizer mesh was failing. Like the holes in a threadbare carpet, splotches of plain reality grew around him, eating out of the mists and crowds, revealing the armies of everyday lab mechs. Where they had been hundreds of thousands of players, now there were open stretches of dark lawn and crowds of real humans standing in shock. Tim, your forklift! The shout was a real sound from Sheila Hanson just a few feet away. Hugh turned back towards the library. He had lost contact with Mind Sum, and he ran toward the mech, and the forklift had continued autonomously for a couple of steps. But this was not a flat lab floor, and the localizer mesh was failing around it. The robot bat had tripped on one of the ornamental boulders that fringed the terrace. It teetered off balance, shrieking location queries in all directions. But now the mesh was gone and the forklift was in trouble. Its onboard system was designed to cope with instability. The failure mode consisted of stepping quickly into a fall, lowering its center of gravity, and dropping stability limbs. And that would have worked down in a clean environment of the labs. But here, the lunge took it to the edge of the north side grade, and there was no localizer mesh to alert the drop. And the stability limb settled into thin air, and the forklift tipped over the edge. And there were screams. Hugh ran out onto the robot battlefield. All the epic imagery was gone, but the robot still had local coordination, and they rolled out of his way, and he scarcely noticed. All his attention was on his forklift. He had direct contact now. He surfed across the forklift's cameras and felt sick. There was someone pinned underneath. He climbed down the hillside and fell to his knees. The woman was trapped there, still screaming. Her leg, up to above the knee, was crushed by the forklift composite. Someone scrambled behind him. Sheila wriggled under the blades of the forklift, reached down to grasp the woman's hand. "We'll get you out. Don't worry, we'll get you out." "Yes," said Tim. He had full control now. Between his own vision and the camera, he could see how it had fallen and where the woman was pinned. "Be cool. Everything will be okay." The forklift put its weight on its knees, and that didn't touch the woman. And there was solid support, no surprises. And from under the blades, he could hear Sheila comforting the woman. "Okay, just put the weight back. Push off in slow sitting position." But now there were other screams and the sounds of people running. Smale to Hume. "Help! Help, Tim!" And Hugh glanced through the camera, and on the other end of the forklift, the robot that had been the greater Scoochamoot was still standing by the library, but now its center of gravity was absurdly high, and someone had overridden all its safeties to push against the nearest pillar, and the mech's foot pad was grinding into the concrete cladding of the terrace, and there was the sound of motors on emergency burn, but in an off-on rhythm that almost sounded musical. The robot looked like a child trying to prop up a teetery bookcase. Hugh turned the camera to look up at the sixth floor overhang. Almost directly overhead, there were gaps in the concrete and places where the floors tilted and swayed. It was a building that had the smarts to stabilize itself, but even to move a little. But now that the intelligence was cut off from location information, like Timothy Hughes' forklift, the library was doing its best to remain standing, and on its own vast scale, it was failing. Okay, so that's it for tonight. And I'm thinking it looks like we probably have like 2 more reading sessions. So, and then after that, I think I need a little bit of a pick-me-up. So I think I'm going to go back and revisit Wrinkle in Time, which is a kid's book. But I think as I'm reading more and more about this Global Brain Project, which if you guys haven't been following my tweets, I'm reading Oliver Reiser's World Sensorium, and Steffers gave this to me as a gift. And it seems to actually be a little bit more legible than the Cosmic Humanism book. And earlier, this one is 1946. Yeah, it seems like this global brain thing is really something to be paying attention to. And, you know, that's the sort of beautiful thing about A Wrinkle in Time is at the end, love wins. Love always wins. So I think that would be a nice pick-me-up. So anyway, thanks for joining in for this evening session. Again, we've got a couple more to go on Rainbow's End, and then we'll be wrapping that up. But I am hoping to, on Saturday, do a live stream with Jason at Argus Fest and talking a little bit about impact investing tied to this gentleman, Mike Murray, who was the marketing guy behind the 1984 Apple ad, and who turns out to be sort of a high-level member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and since 2000 has been based out of Seattle and working globally on impact investing. So I have a lot of pieces to knit together, and I think actually the snake sidewalk at the UCSD library fits into that. So, you know, that'll be going up on the channel. I don't know that we'll necessarily do that live, but we'll probably at least, you know, we'll be posting it afterwards. And then on Thursday evening, and I know they don't do this live, but it should probably post by the weekend sometime. I'm doing a conversation with the What's Left podcast with those guys. And I'm going to actually be going over an article I wrote a couple months ago, like in December, January, about conditional cash transfers and Mexico being a pilot for that, which I think is very much, this was back in the 90s, sort of a takeover of, you know, women and children and health and education and food access. And that has a lot to do with what's coming with blockchain UBI, I think, unfortunately. So anyway, I'll have a couple more conversations coming up beside the Read Aloud. So thanks. And definitely tell people about Oliver Reiser and the World Sensorium, because I feel like that's another key layer to this onion. So good night, everybody.